Now, something interesting to notice, though, is that the face, the actual human face representing the sun on Solar's shield and tunic, appears to be decidedly feminine, which is I thought that was very interesting. And also something to think about is Solar, the way it's spelled in Dark Souls, Solaire, is feminine. That's a feminine name. So there seems to be a touch of femininity hiding in plain sight here. So that kind of clued me in. I thought, I should look into this more and see where this goes. Because a feminine sun isn't something which is typically found in Western esoteric traditions, right? It's typically the sun is masculine and the moon is feminine, right? At least this is how it appears on the surface. So we're about to take an interesting detour for a moment and follow these feminine clues and see where they lead us. And if we look at the origins of the surname Astor, which is Germanic in origin, a very interesting coincidence is revealed. So if we know Solar of Astor is some sort of Teutonic or Germanic knight, then we can start to put together some interesting things here. Because the coincidence being, and maybe this is probably a coincidence, but I could not help myself, that the sun, and remember, sun in German is actually a feminine noun. It's spelled S-O-N-N-E. So Astor being a German name in the German language and also in German folklore, as we shall see in German mythology, the sun is indeed feminine, whereas the moon, or Mond in German, M-O-N-D, is a masculine noun. So it seems our Solar, or Solaire from Dark Souls, has an interesting, albeit unconventional connection to the divine feminine. I will explain in detail why the sun has been traditionally compared with the masculine aspect energy instead of the feminine. However, the question should be asked, what would be the reason for the sun symbol having a feminine face in Dark Souls to begin with? And as it turns out, the reasoning actually leads us down an interesting road, crossing paths of two seemingly disparate cultures, yet they are indeed closely linked to the Dark Souls universe. The first reason which explains, and we talked about this a little bit, about the Germanic language, is that the feminine sun is that of the ancient and Germanic, it's from the ancient Germanic and Norse pagan cultures venerating the sun as a goddess and the moon as a masculine god, as told in the prose and poetic Eddas from Norse culture. This likely began because ancient horticultural societies typically had women producing a lot of the food. Horticulture is a smaller scale, and there's other differences. I'm not an expert, but compared to agriculture would have much more of a masculine energy to it, where horticulture would have more of a feminine energy to it. The deities in a culture often favor the gender that produces the food. At least this is a theory that has been looked into fairly widely, and there seems to be that pattern that the horticultural societies are typically going to venerate the most gods in a pantheon in a horticultural society are going to be feminine, essentially. Doesn't mean they're going to be the sun's necessarily going to be feminine, but there's a likelihood it probably could be. Whereas with agriculture, which came later, it's much of a larger scale. It demands more men to take on the task of food production. There's It's just larger, and it requires then progressively heavier equipment and animals and things that are, and men are just men are bigger and they're more muscular, obviously, so they're going to do more of the heavy lifting, the manual labor type of stuff. When agriculture or horticulture scales and turns into agriculture. So when this food production changes from horticulture to agriculture, sometimes the deities actually shift from feminine to masculine, which of course is commensurate with the change in food production, but this isn't a strict rule. So this image we see here, this is the Germanic sun goddess here in her chariot at the top, and we have the moon god at the bottom, and it looks like they're being chased by wolves of the night in the sky. So another reason for the sun being feminine is that the ancestors of Astor baked this worldview into the Germanic language, since it was already a part of the ancient Germanic pantheon in the first place. As a result of the early import of the Proto-Indo-European language from Asia and its adapted use of animate and inanimate nouns, which were eventually subsumed into the German language, combined with this long-established mythology of the sun being a goddess, it would make sense why this esoteric symbol has flipped genders in the Germanic and Norse tradition. While I haven't researched if the Wiccan associations with the feminine and nature also relate to the sun in this way, it certainly wouldn't surprise me if there was some sort of connection there as well. And I should also remark one other thing we see here in all of these panels is the sunflowers, right? Which is an amazing synthesis of masculine and feminine, because the feminine, of course, feminine and flower goes hand in hand, right? Women are nature, women are creation. They're that which manifests, and flowers have traditionally always been feminine. And it's interesting because the sunflower representing the sun, there's this very interesting blend, right? In my mind, at least, from if I'm making an association to the sun is masculine, right? It kind of turns it on its head to see these images, right? It's very interesting, but it's an interesting perspective worth looking at. Now, here's where this also ties in to Dark Souls, because it seems another interesting coincidence that the sun in Japan is also embodied by a feminine deity known as Amaterasu, depicted here in these panels, given the fact that the creator of Dark Souls himself, right, Mr. Miyazaki, is Japanese, of course, right? So it should be noted that while the sun is traditionally thought of as masculine, the number of sun goddesses found in cultures throughout the world is more common than one would think. I was quite surprised at finding just how many sun goddesses there were around the world. So I think it's very interesting with Dark Souls, because you have you have an Eastern interpretation of a Western feudal landscape, right? At a time when you had, ladies and lords and kings and knights and that sort of thing, right? It's an interesting parallel, very interesting parallel. And I think that's why, because if you take the samurai of the East and the feudal system of Japan, there's a lot of parallels between the feudal system of Japan and the whole samurai thing that happened with the knights and the kings and that sort of thing, the feudal European landscape, right? So there's a lot of parallels. So it's very interesting that the that a Japanese developer it's no surprise that they would create an amazing interpretation. They're using some of their, obviously they can't help but use some of their cultural understanding of the world and their cultural identity and the way they see the worldview, the Eastern worldview, and then using that in a parallel kind of world. It's a very interesting mix. So Dark Souls is really special for a lot of reasons, but that's one reason that it's such an interesting game. So after all, yin and yang, or masculine and feminine, these energies are not true opposites. So we have to think in terms of, if the sun can be feminine, does that completely invalidate the sun being masculine? And of course it doesn't, right? Because they're not true opposites, but rather they're different sides of the same coin. They're different ends of the same polarity. So they are of the same universal force and energy. Only expressions of this force in ways which complement each other and serve to make the one or the all move or work together in the first place. You need the two, or you just don't have the reality as we understand it. Hence, the very meaning of the word, this is interesting, the word universe, by the way, very interesting. Uni, U-N-I, means unified or one, and verse, V-E-R-S-E, means to turn or unfold, which is a word, verse is a word which describes the eternal cycle of creation and destruction, or masculine and feminine. Verse means to turn. It's basically a cycle. So it's universe basically means one cycle, one eternal cycle. And of course, it takes masculine and feminine, it takes this energy polarity, right, into account. That's the force of creation and destruction, masculine and feminine. Probably the best known example of a solar goddess character in video games would be Yuna from Final Fantasy X. There are actually quite a lot of parallels between Yuna and Jesus Christ. I tend to think this wasn't an accident, given how well crafted the Final Fantasy story is. In this scene, Yuna walks upon the water with the sun shining upon her. It's as if she's taking the power from the sun, right, in order to do what she's doing on the water, and she's taking place in this resurrection ceremony, which of course is another thing associated with Christ. Who else, I have to ask you this, who else or what else walks on water? Not only Jesus, the Son of God, but the sun itself also walks on water. Maybe this walking on water stuff in the Bible is an allegory for something. Maybe it's referring to the light and the masculine and the interaction between the sun and the water. Because, of course, the water is feminine, the sun is masculine, right? Walking upon the water, I wouldn't interpret that as some kind of, that wouldn't be a masculine domination, right? I wouldn't interpret that way at all. I would see it more akin as a description of the integral link between the two energies, and how closely they are related in the ultimate sense, right? In the ultimate universal sense, just how closely, intimately the sun and the water, or light and water, are related.